Hello everyone! A lot of people, especially creationists, have misconceptions about the seemingly sudden radiation of animal phyla around the beginning of the Cambrian that earned it the name the Cambrian Explosion. This and the following video on the Cambrian Explosion will seek to alleviate some of those misconceptions. So, let's jump right in. Creationists often claim that complex, fully formed animal groups called phyla appeared very suddenly during an event called the Cambrian Explosion. They also claim that no evidence exists for common descent or evolution occurring prior to this event and that these Cambrian fauna appeared in largely the same form that animals have today, implying that no significant evolution occurred after it. However, this is far from accurate. First, some background. The Cambrian is the first period of the Paleozoic era and lasted around 57 million years, from 542 to 485 million years ago. The Cambrian explosion itself has been estimated to have lasted for about 20 to 25 million years. Sudden in terms of geology, but not in terms of biology. It's also true that most of the creatures that we are familiar with, even the famous extinct ones, didn't appear until hundreds of millions of years after the Cambrian. This was long before there were any sharks, bony fish, dinosaurs, birds, amphibians, mammals, and therefore humans. Among the Cambrian critters, the closest things to all those previously mentioned were small, jawless, fish-like creatures such as Hycoichthyes. In fact, nothing was living on land except possibly some fungi and bacteria. They get around. But they clearly didn't make landfall until around 500 million years ago, well into the explosion. The earliest land plants were the amphibious bryophytes, reaching land around 450 million years ago in the Ordovician, which was shortly followed by the first terrestrial animals such as the insects, 35 million years after the Cambrian had ended. So you can see that there wasn't much life on land during the Cambrian. There was a lot of life in the water though, no surprise, since life started in the water. There's a popular misconception that life began in the Cambrian because, until 1947, no fossils were known from the Precambrian. But this belief is false. Life had already been in existence for over 3.3 billion years by the time the Cambrian rolled around, both known from fossils and inferred from phylogenetics. The vast majority of these organisms were unicellular microbes, but life started reaching new heights in the late Precambrian, with the first definitively multicellular organisms appearing in a period known as the Ediacaran, which spanned 635 to 542 million years ago. Numerous organisms are described from this time, but unfortunately, how they relate to modern organisms is often poorly understood. The reason for this is that these organisms have body plans very different from the animals we know so well, or their body plan is so simple in terms of not having many definitive features that we can use to classify them with modern organisms. And nothing alive today seems to be closely related to or descended from those Ediacaran creatures. Take the rangiomorphs like Charnia, for example. These organisms look like the fronds of weird ferns, but it has no living or fossilized counterparts following the Precambrian. Hypotheses on their affinity vary wildly from non-skeletal animals to a type of fungi or a group not more closely related to either of them. Despite looking vaguely like a leaf, we are quite certain that they aren't plants nor any other photosynthetic organisms, since the rocks wherein the fossils were found indicate that they lived deep on the ocean floor, far below the sunlight zone. One of the earlier proposed affinities for these creatures was linking them to sea pens, to which they bear some striking similarities. However, sea pens have opposing extremities that run parallel along a central stem, and the whole animal grows by adding new segments at the base, whereas rangiomorphs grow by adding new segments in an alternating pattern, which are added at the top, and each segment repeats the same process at a smaller scale, making it a fractal. So it is unlikely that they were sea pens, but their fractal branching morphology and lack of any internal digestive system tells us that they were most likely osmotrophs, passively absorbing dissolved nutrients from the surrounding water. Osmotrophs need a high surface area per volume ratio for maintaining a sufficient rate of absorption, and being a fractal is a good way of doing this, but this still doesn't tell us what they are. There is another possibility which, if true, would make it more difficult for us to determine their relationships. Life has made the jump to multicellularity independently many times. The most familiar examples are animals, plants, and fungi, but there are many more that have been regarded as protists, an outdated term for unicellular eukaryotes, like kelp and many other obscure lineages. As there are more extinct groups than extant ones, it is not unlikely that there would have been many more multicellular lineages that are now completely extinct. Perhaps Charnia was one of these lineages, but if it was, then we wouldn't be able to determine their relationship from the fossils alone, as its unique morphological characteristics aren't shared by any extant lineage. This isn't likely to be resolved until we get more fossils or the burgeoning field of paleogenomics gets around to retroengineering them. Now, while there were many weird organisms in the Precambrian, there were also many true animals or metazoans. The oldest potential fossils of animals date to around 610 million years ago and look sponge-like. After that, the next oldest potential animal fossils date to 575 million years ago. Understand that the ancestors of animals split from the ancestors of choanoflagellates around 800 million years ago, which occurred in the Tonian period of the Precambrian. Later, the Metazoan, or last common ancestor of all metazoans, is thought to have originated around 650 million years ago, firmly in the Cryogenian period. And this animal was explored in Common Ancestry Part 4. During this period, the world was wrecked by massive ice ages, where ice even extended to equatorial regions. Researchers describe the Earth as a snowball, or, more recently, a slush ball during that time because of the near ubiquity of the ice. As for the land, the supercontinent Rodinia had broken apart by the time the Cryogenian had started, with the short-lived supercontinent Pannotia forming in the late Ediacaran, where we have even more derived animals. Dickinsonia, like Charnia, has had a hotly debated placement for decades, but recent studies, such as the 2015 paper Ancestral State Reconstruction of Ontogeny Supports a Bilaterian Affinity for Dickinsonia, propose that Dickinsonia is indeed an early bilaterally symmetrical animal. There are even Ediacaran trace fossils, such as Treptichnus pedum, which looks much like the type of burrowing structure that a preapulid worm makes. While the bilaterian affinity of the previous examples is uncertain, another fossil called Cambriella is almost certainly a true bilaterian, and it might even be a true mollusk, or a close relative of them, though that affinity is less certain. The presence of bilaterians shows us that animals had already diverged into lineages with relative complex body plans. And if Cambriella is a true mollusk, then deuterostomes and protostomes, and probably some of the phyla within them, must have diverged from one another long before it lived. In other words, animals had already diversified into many groups with complex features over a long period of time prior to the start of the Cambrian period. So, understand that our ancestor 650 million years ago was probably sponge-like. Then, according to one hypothesis, ctenophores are the next branch of the tree, splitting about 620 million years ago. Because this was covered in Common Ancestry Part 4, I'll be brief here. We share common ancestors with placozoans, cnidarians, acoelomorph flatworms, protostomes, and ambulacraria, all before the Cambrian started, according to the 2017 paper, Dating Early Animal Evolution Using Phylogenomic Data. Understand that the phyla, Porifera, Ctenophora, Placozoa, acoelomorph flatworms, or much larger clades, protostomes and ambulacraria, formed millions of years before the Cambrian started. In fact, the aforementioned 2017 paper points out that whichever hypothesis one uses to group early animals, their radiations begin during the Cryogenian, not the Cambrian. So, numerous lineages of animals and other organisms were already living and diversifying long before the Cambrian began. This makes sense because some animal developmental genes, the Hox genes, were already present in the animals living back in the Cryogenian. Both Hox and para-Hox genes seem to have arisen from some proto-Hox cluster, which is currently being studied by researchers. We also know more complex animals were crawling around and even burrowing into the seafloor by the late Precambrian, documented by their trace fossils even when we don't have their tiny bodies preserved directly. On top of that, there is clear fossil evidence for predation in the Precambrian, where shelled animals show boreholes such as Cloudina. In fact, the very existence of shelled life before the big explosion testifies to the complexity of life by then, even if we don't have their body fossils to see what they look like. Thus, we see that the roots of animals and some of their important genes are firmly within the Precambrian. But the question is, why did animals rise to dominance in the Cambrian when the Ediacaran creatures were dominant in the late Precambrian? Well, we'll cover some hypotheses for that in the next video. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.